Hey my glam girls, welcome back to my channel. It's Chelsea, where we talk about all things glam and all things girly. I'm a beauty consultant who loves to talk about everything dealing with beauty and makeup, and today I have never had so many of you all say yes, review a product. I don't think. And we are talking about the new Makeup by Mario Ethereal Eyes eyeshadow palette. So stay tuned to see how I created both of these eye looks. Of course, I will share with you my thoughts and we'll do a couple of comparisons at the end, so stay tuned for all of that. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I truly do appreciate it. And let's get right into this video. So yes, you all were like, Chelsea, yes, please pick up this eyeshadow palette. And if you can, get the video up before the Sephora Savings event ends. And so that's what we're doing today. So this is his new Ethereal Eyes eyeshadow palette. It does retail for $68 and we get a total of 12 grams of product. Each pan is worth 1 gram of product, or 0.04 ounces of product. So this is his anniversary eyeshadow palette. It is limited edition, and he says it's a multi-finish eyeshadow palette with 12 neutral translucent shades in suede mattes, natural metallics, and glossy shimmer finishes. It says that this is Mario's dream palette with 12 new signature shades that create effortless ethereal eye looks. It features 3 unique finishes. And then it says the suede mattes offer an enhanced grip for rich color. The natural metallics feature micronized pigments for a seamless application. And then the glossy shimmers, they are a first of its kind formula, and they are infused with pearls coated with emollient binders to impart a reflective, wet-like shine on the lids. So I know you've already seen swatches of the eyeshadows, but I do want to quickly go over the shades and the formulation so you know which ones are the mattes, the metallics, and the glossy shimmers. So we have a total of 7 mattes in the eyeshadow palette. So we've got the mattes here, here, and then I want to say right here. So the mattes are easy to identify, but the shimmers and the metallics might be a little harder to identify. Then the shimmer finishes, the one that's supposed to leave like a wet look on the eyes, are these 3 right here. And then the 2 metallics are gonna be this shade right here and this shade right here. So getting into the 2 eye looks that I created, I first wanted to create a look concentrating on these shades in the palette, and then I wanted to create a separate look concentrating with these shades in the palette. So we first start off with, and he calls his shades just EE and then a number. So we're starting off with EE3, which is this shade right here. And I will say these mattes are really pigmented. Looking at them in the pan, I was like, these are either gonna come off really light and kind of dusty, or we might get like a little bit of pigmentation. But when I was looking at it, I was like, I don't know how much depth we're gonna get from them. And I will admit, these mattes are definitely rich. Like, even some of the lighter shades I felt really showed up on my skin and you could see them. It wasn't just like, well, I just put something on there, we don't know what it is, but we're gonna keep it moving. So even starting off with this shade right here, I felt like I could see it on my eyes and see a difference of where I placed the eyeshadow compared to just the natural tone of my eyelid. Then I wanted to go in with this beautiful pink color. He calls it a dusty mauve matte. Beautiful shade. The first shade that I put on my eye, he describes that as a muted peach matte. Once again, a really beautiful shade. And then after that, I went in with the shade EE4 and wanted to build that kind of like in the center of the eye. And this shade did take some building, but I did eventually get to a pigmentation that I was satisfied with. He describes EE4, this shade right here, as a soft brown matte. And then I went in with the deepest shade in the palette, which is a neutral rich brown matte shade as he describes it. And I definitely saw pigmentation right off the bat, even though I placed it in a smaller portion of the eye on the upper eyelid. Then I got into the metallic shades. So first going in with this shade that he calls medium brown metallic shade. very high pigmentation with that as well. I would say that this metallic shade is more of like a traditional shimmer shade. Like you can use your finger and get like much more pigmentation, or you can build it up quite nicely with a brush, but you definitely have an opaque base with this metallic shimmer. And then I put the other metallic shade in the inner portion of the eye. Once again, really nice and has a nice opaque base. So the two metallic shades, if you wanted to use them on the eyes alone and you wanted them to have pigmentation or like an opaque base, you are gonna get that from these shades. But I also like that you can sheer them out as well, because for the inner portion of the eye, I didn't want it to be like so stark. And so I just kept blending that shade and it was able to blend out to my liking. I felt like it wasn't so just like pow, all of this sheen in the inner portion of the eye. And so I typically don't do a brow bone highlight. It's just not my thing a lot of times, but I do love an ethereal eyeshadow shimmer, and I had to put a brow bone highlight on my eyes. So I went in with EE2. He describes this as a champagne shimmer, and I put that on there and I was like, yes, yes, and more yes. Okay. Lower lash line, I just went back in with EE12, and then I smoked that out with EE7. And then for the inner corner, I went back in with EE11. And that's how we got this eye look. Now moving on to this one, I first went in with the shade called EE5. He describes it as a cool taupe matte. And this shade, I was like, whoa. Okay, pigmentation and okay, shade. Like, taupes, I have come to really love a good, like cool toned taupe. Like it's something about it when the actual undertones and tones are done right. And I was like, I like this. Like it's cool toned against my skin, but I don't feel like it looks ashy. It's definitely not one of those like one and done shades for my complexions, but it is definitely a shade that I can work with, that I don't have to do too much with it, because so I don't look like I've got a bruised eye. Like I'm loving that shade. And then after that, I went in with EE1, which he describes as a creamy beige matte. And so I used that to blend out the edges of the cool taupe matte shade, and I loved how it blended it out. This is also a really beautiful matte brow bone highlight if you're around my complexion and that's the type of brow bone highlights that you like. So then I went in with these beautiful glossy shimmers in the middle. So first I went in with EE6, which he describes as a sandy shimmer, and I put that all over the eye. So first I applied it with a flat brush. I went in with the Rephr 02 brush, and I saw, like, I knew that this was going to be like that shimmery topper type of formula. So I wasn't expecting an opaque base from this shade. So you see me apply it with my brush, and then I went in with my finger to see if I could build up the pigmentation better with that, and you can. So if you do want to get a little bit more like impactfulness from these gloss-like shimmers, use your finger and build it up that way. But I do like how I can use a brush with it as well, because it looks like fairy dust on my eyes. And like, that formula has come out a few times this year, and I will show you the eyeshadow palettes that I'm thinking of, and I have loved it in every eyeshadow palette that it has come in. So like, I knew right off the bat that these shades were gonna be my shades. I just knew them. So then for the inner corner, I went in with EE10, and this is described as a golden shimmer, and you can definitely see the difference in tone. This of course has a cooler tone, and this has more of a warmer tone, and you can see that gold shift in the inner corner. But once again, same type of like lighter, ethereal, fairy dust type of formulation. I know fairy dust is not like real, you know, depending on what you think, but that's like the best way that I can describe it. And then I did want that same brow bone highlighted effect, so I went back in with EE2 for the brow bone. And then for the lower lash line, I went in with the last shade that we hadn't tried yet, which was EE9, and he describes this as a neutral brown matte. And I will say, I felt like the pigmentation, I thought the pigmentation was gonna just be a bit more, but I was able to build it up. But I thought I was gonna get like intense pigmentation like I had gotten from the other mattes. well, I would say from these two mattes. These two mattes I had to build up to get the color that I wanted, which I was able to achieve, but it wasn't like that rich intensity right off the bat like I got from the taupe shade and then this neutral dark brown shade. But I was able to build up the pigmentation with this one, and then I smoked it out with the taupe shade. And then for the inner corner, I went in with this shade for the inner corner of the eye for the lower lash line. And those are the two eye looks. So I'm going to say this. Well, first of all, let me talk about what I like about the palette, if there's things that I don't like. So what I do like about this palette is that it is a neutral palette with cooler tones and warmer tones. Looking at this palette on Sephora's website and in some of the pictures, to me, it leaned more cool tone all the way around. And even some of you all thought the same thing, because I had some of you all comment like, it's a pretty palette, but it's too cool for me. And it's actually a good combination of warmer tones and cooler tones. I would say the warmer tones in the palette are more neutral, as he has described them. None of these warmer tones pull extremely warm. They're gonna lean more neutral warm. But you do see warmer tones, you do see cooler tones. Like I think for this eye look, we're pulling more warm, like neutral warm, and then we see more of a cooler tone with this eye look. And I love when eyeshadow palettes can do that, because if you're someone who does like warmer tones, you can get your warm tones out of the palette, but then it might allow you to try some cooler tones and mix them so that you can get full use of the palette. I like that with the mattes that he put in this palette, that you can get a nice bit of differences of eye looks and combinations of eye looks. And with this deepest brown shade, I feel like it can work for a decent amount of complexions. This is definitely not going to be a smoke shade for everyone. And of course, it's not gonna provide the depth for a lot of deeper complexions. But I do think that this is a good all-in-one eyeshadow palette for a good amount of shades. I'll say for a good amount of shades, not a plethora of shades and not for the most shades, but for a good amount of shades. We could use this palette and it could be a full use type of palette, meaning I may not have to reach outside of this palette to get the shades that I want. And in terms of the shimmer shades and the metallic shades, I love them. I think they are beautiful. And like I mentioned before, this like fairy dust types of shade, like it is, those are like my, like I said, those have been some of my favorite shades this year. Now, in terms of like improvements, I do feel like, and you know, these are just my preferences, I do feel like we could have taken out maybe one of these shades and added a deeper shade in this palette, like a deeper, cooler toned, like almost like brown black shade would have been phenomenal. Because I don't think we need both of these shades. I think we can take one out and then added a deeper shade so that this palette really could have worked for more complexions and shades, because you would have had that deeper, like deeper brown, almost black shade to be a really good smoke shade and depth shade. And then maybe we could have taken out one of these shades to add another deeper shade. So this, just like I said, could have been a more well-rounded shade for a really good amount of complexions. But in all honesty, I don't have too many more complaints outside of those, or I should say suggestions, because formula-wise, I really enjoy this formula. With the metallic shades, and I would say with a little bit of these glossy shades, there was a little bit of fallout, but nothing that was like overwhelming. Don't think fallout like Anastasia palettes. I feel like her palettes give the most fallout. And even though the shades are beautiful, it's like, yeah, do your eyes first, then go in with your base makeup. I didn't really get too much fallout at all with these. I really didn't have to clean anything up, but I just kind of noticed just a little, so I wanted to point that out. And with the matte shades, I didn't really find any fallout at all. Like the matte shades were rich and they were buildable and they were pigmented. There was some kick up in the pan, but nothing where I had to feel like I had to keep going like, because there's some palettes where like I'm doing my eye look and every time I put my brush in there, I'm like, because like, you know, there's just so much fallout and carryover into other pans in the palette. And I didn't get that at all with this type of formulation. So formulation wise, I think it is stunner. Like this is a beautiful palette. And I think he named it perfectly with this ethereal eyes, because if you think about what ethereal means, when I think of ethereal, I think angelic, I think light, I think fairy dust, I think shimmers, and like just this effortless like glow that you're gonna get from whatever is termed ethereal. And I think he accomplished that perfectly, because when I look at my eyes, I'm like, yes, yes, and yes. Like, especially this eye, it is giving the ethereal. It is giving like that angelic, just, you know, fairy dust look on the eyes. It looks beautiful. Like if I were in the sunlight, it would just be sparkling under the rays of sun, and it would just be heavenly. And I think that's exactly what he wanted to accomplish with this palette, and I think he nailed it. Now, in terms of who this palette is gonna work best for, is it worth your money? Because I've had some of you all already ask, like, is this palette worth it? And for $68, I do understand this is pretty pricey. Like when I saw the price tag, that's why I asked y'all. If I'm being dead honest, I was like, now this looks pretty. But is this a palette I need to purchase like right now? Because $68, like I wasn't thinking this palette was gonna be $68. I was thinking a good $45, maybe a $50. $68, I was like, let me see if these people wanna see a review, which y'all did. So I will say maybe the biggest like, you know, strike for this palette is the price. Do I think it's worth $68? I'm gonna say no, in the sense of like, that is a pretty high price tag. I mean, after taxes, especially if you were to purchase this after the Sephora savings event, you're paying over $70-some for this palette. Now, am I upset and disappointed and like, do I want to return this palette because I don't think it's worth the money? Not at all. However, I'm very glad that I did get it on sale, because with the Sephora savings event, I was able to save 20% off. So it brought this palette down to like $54 after tax. And at that price point, I am happy with it. I'm like I said, $45, $50, that's where I think this palette should have been priced at, because that's what I'm getting from this palette. However, I'm like, we are getting 12 shades. The formulation is amazing, and I love this palette. Like, this is definitely one of those palettes that I will be picking up multiple times, because number one, it has the tones in it that I like. And also, like I mentioned before, I'm just loving the formulation of the shades in this palette. So for you, if you have to make the decision, first of all, consider the price tag. $68, is that how much I want to pay for an eyeshadow palette? And if the answer is no, maybe wait for a sale, because I'm pretty sure we're gonna see more sales coming up toward the end of this year. And then in terms of like complexions, I think this palette will work well for really all complexions. I'm gonna say all complexions with a caveat. So for instance, if you are, you know, my complexion and a few shades deeper, I think you could get this palette and use every shade in the palette and be satisfied with your eye looks if you just stayed with the shades in this palette. Now, if you are going to get into the deeper, richer complexions, you're of course gonna have to reach outside of this palette to get your smoke shade, to get your depth shade. But I do feel like you could very well use all of the shimmers and metallics in this palette. Depending on how deep and rich your complexion is, these shades right here and potentially this shade may not do much for you at all. So I would say if you have deeper, richer complexions, you are gonna have to consider, you know, for the price tag and for the shades that I am gonna be able to wear compared to the shades that I probably won't reach for, will this palette be worth your money? And I think based upon whatever answer you come up with, that will be the deciding factor for you to get it. And if I like, you know, do I think this palette is worth it? For me, I am not upset that I picked it up. Even if I would have paid full price for this palette, I would not have been upset paying for it. But I do understand for $68 and looking at the palette based on especially how much his first palettes were worth, I was just like, what? Okay, Mario? And maybe, I don't know, maybe this glossy formula is a little more expensive to make, and that's why the price of the palette is higher. But I think it is worth it for me because of how I know I love shades like this and how I will use it. But I'm definitely not going to say this is like drop all your coins and go get it, because you got to answer those questions that I asked you based on your preferences, how you think you can use this palette, and how much use you will get from it. Now, for some comparisons, because if you have some of these other eyeshadow palettes at home, you may not feel the need to pick up this one. So the first formulation that I thought of, and I have to thank Sophia C's Beauty for this as well, because as soon as she said it, I was like, you are absolutely right. Wayne Goss, okay? Okay, so the first eyeshadow palette from Wayne Goss that I am looking at, and I'm like, this is a really, not dupe at all, but like, we can get similar tones from it. We have Wayne Goss's Smoky Quartz, and then of course, Makeup by Mario's palette. And so with the Wayne Goss palette, we're only getting 6 shades, but the shades are quite large. And he also markets his eyeshadow palettes as face palettes as well. And for some of the tones in his eyeshadow palettes, I have used them as blushes and highlights on my face as well. So you can get multiple, you can use his eyeshadow palettes in multiple ways, especially if the color story fits colors that you would wear on your face. But this, he calls it his diamond formula in his eyeshadow palettes, but it's that same kind of ethereal type of shade. So let's, for instance, I'm gonna swatch this shade in the Wayne Goss palette compared to this shade right here in Mario's palette. And formulation-wise, they do feel differently. Makeup by Mario's glossy formula is smoother than Wayne Goss's. But look, this is Makeup by Mario's shade, and this is Wayne Goss's shade, and they look very similar. So we've got Makeup by Mario and then Wayne Goss. I'm telling myself so I can remember how to point to. Okay, so this is Wayne Goss's shade right here, and then this is Makeup by Mario's shade right here. Now, Makeup by Mario's shade is going to have less of a base to it than Wayne Goss's shade, but they have that same kind of ethereal fairy dust formulation. And when you put them on the eyes, Wayne Goss's looks just like this. Now, I will say, like, I do see that wet kind of look that Makeup by Mario was saying that you get from his eyeshadow formula, but I feel like you also get that as well from Wayne Goss's diamond shade as well. It looks stunning, because I have taken Wayne Goss's diamond shades and just put them like as brow bone highlights, or like place them just like along the center of the eye look, and pulled it up so you can like almost see a radiation of like that glow going all the way up the lid, and it's just stunning. Okay, some other Wayne Goss eyeshadow palettes that came to mind that you can like get some of these same tones from the Makeup by Mario palette. I have his original eyeshadow palette. It's the Imperial Topaz, and Riley Girl has broken up so many of these shades in the palette, so forgive my broken up palette. But you've got this shimmer shade in this palette that reminds me of a couple of the shades in his Makeup by Mario one, as well as this matte shade right here. And then one of my favorite Wayne Goss palettes, like ever, because the Smoky Quartz would be my second favorite Wayne Goss palette, but this one right here, this is the Pearl palette. And honestly, now that I'm looking at it, the Pearl palette may be more of a closer replica of the Makeup by Mario palette than the Smoky Quartz one. Now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, this actually looks very similar to the Makeup by Mario palette. So if you've got any of these Wayne Goss palettes, and especially if you've gotten a couple of them, you might already have a good amount of shades in the Wayne Goss palettes that could replicate the looks that you're gonna get in the Makeup by Mario palette. So, I mean, I'm not saying don't get it. I'm just saying, if you're someone who was on the fence and you're like, I don't really know if I wanna spend the money, but it really looks pretty. If you've got some Wayne Goss palettes, then you probably have most of those shades. The other formulation that I thought of was the Chanel Tweed eyeshadow palettes, and more specifically, I was thinking of, is it Brunette Rose? yes, this is the 04 eyeshadow palette. And granted, we're only getting 4 shades, but this color story reminds me of the cooler tones in the Makeup by Mario palette. And this shade right here, I'm gonna swatch it next to the 2 swatches that we already did. So let's put it right here. So this is that kind of glossy shimmery shade from the Tweed palette, and then this is the Makeup by Mario shade, and then the Wayne Gosh shade. It gives me a similar kind of fairy dust ethereal look to the eye, and I really, once again, really enjoy it. It's one of my favorite, I would say it is my favorite shade in this palette, and I love it. So those were some of the comparisons that I thought of like right off the back, that if you have these eyeshadow palettes, then you have some of the formulas in the Makeup by Mario palette. So if you didn't want to buy it because the price tag was a bit unjustifiable for you, then you kind of already have some of this formulation already. And if you've got eyeshadow palettes with great formulated matte shades, then you know this may not be one that you need to buy. However, if you don't have an eyeshadow palette like this and you don't have formulations like this, that's where I'm gonna say maybe you wanna go ahead and get it, because this is beautiful. Like, this is stunning, okay? And I am so happy that I have it. And like I said, whether I would have paid full price for this or if I would have saved money for it, I would have been completely happy with the purchase. And I'm very happy that you all wanted to see a review on this, because I'm so happy that I picked it up now, because it was sitting in my cart and I was just kind of like, if nobody wants to see this, I'm gonna just leave it at the store. This is one of those cases where I'm really glad that you all convinced me to get it. So that is my review, guys. Let me know your thoughts down below, what you think of these eye looks, the eyeshadow palette. Now that you've seen it in action, is it something you're gonna pick up? Of course, I will have all links down below as to what I'm wearing on my face, and of course links to this eyeshadow palette. And if you're watching this video today or the next couple of days, you can save some money through the Sephora Savings event, so it would be a great time to pick it up so that you can get a little bit off. And if you've made it to this point in the video and you have yet to subscribe to my channel, I would love for you to consider subscribing and joining the Glam Girl Squad. And guys, that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope to see you in my very next video. Bye, guys.